Yeah, you. Welcome to the debate. Today we're chatting about religion and society. Gonna try and keep it chill but punchy.
Yeah, and it's a big one. We're not really getting into like the theology itself, are we? More the function of it all.
Exactly. Think of it sociologically. Is religion, when you view it as this like super powerful social technology, is it providing a net positive surplus for modern society? Or do the downsides, the liabilities, kind of outweigh the benefits? We're basically looking at its functional balance sheet, assets versus liabilities.
Gotcha. And just so folks know where we stand.
Right. So I'll be arguing that the social infrastructure, the community, the meaning that religion provides, it's kind of irreplaceable, actually. And under the right conditions, yeah, I think it's fundamentally net positive.
Okay. And I'm coming from the other side. I'm arguing that those risks, the control, the exclusion, the way it gets tangled up with politics, I think those are like structural costs. They're baked into the system. And in diverse modern countries, I think that makes its overall effect, well, often negative. The cost just might be too high.
Okay, well, let me kick off then. I see where you're coming from with the risks, but let me offer a different perspective, kind of rooted in history and function. My core point starts here. Religion is like the original social technology. It was around way before the modern state, before mass literacy even. For thousands of years, it was the fundamental network machine for getting huge groups of people to work together.
You're basically talking Durkheim here, aren't you? The whole social glue idea, religion holding society together.
Precisely. Emil Durkheim nailed it. And, the data actually backs this up. Look at studies from places like Pew Research. They consistently show that being actively involved in a religious community, it correlates really strongly with some key good things. People report being happier, they tend to have better physical and mental health, and maybe most importantly, huge levels of civic engagement. And the key thing is the benefits really cluster around people who are active participants, right? Not just folks who tick a box saying they identify. That tells you the power is in the doing, the community, the infrastructure itself. It's a working machine.
Okay. I can grant the micro benefits within the community structure. Yeah.
But I think it's bigger than just local community. It's like a massive logistics machine for empathy, almost, on a global scale. We know that religiously active people, they give way more money, like higher percentages of their income, to charity. And often that includes secular charities too, not just religious ones. And then look globally, especially in the global south, right? Where governments are often weak or, frankly, absent. Faith-based groups are frequently the only real infrastructure for welfare. Think schools, clinics, big aid distribution networks. This is what sociologists sometimes call the substitution hypothesis. Playing out, religion steps in where the state fails.
Okay.
And beyond that huge logistical footprint, there's the existential stuff. Max Weber, he talked about this problem of the disenchanted world, modern life, all rational and bureaucratic, kind of strips away meaning, right? Mystery? Well, religion tackles that head on. It offers a coherent story, an overarching narrative. It creates what Mircea Eliade called sacred time, something set apart from the everyday grind. And honestly, secular alternatives, things like, individualized wellness culture or the whole spiritual but not religious thing, they just don't seem to replicate that collective depth because they're so focused on the self, not the group.
That's a strong case for the asset side of the ledger. But I've got to push back hard on the cost-benefit analysis right there. Because that whole net positive claim, I think it really falls apart when you look closely at the mechanism itself. The very thing that makes the machine strong is also what structurally guarantees division.
Okay, so where specifically does the liability become structural, like inherent, rather than just bad actors or context?
Well, let's take that cohesion you were just praising, that super tight bonding capital, that intense trust within the religious group. That's also the dark side, isn't it? That very strength inherently generates pretty severe outgroup derogation. We have data showing that strong religiosity often correlates negatively with general social trust, especially when you look at diverse societies. You learn to trust the person next to you in the pew, absolutely. But the almost necessary flip side is you learn to distrust, or at least be suspicious of, the stranger who isn't inside those sacred walls.
And furthermore, I tend to see religion primarily as a machine for control, a norm police, if you like. I'm thinking here about Foucault's idea of pastoral power. This isn't power through force necessarily, but power exercised by offering deep personal care, the authority to look after your soul, your conduct. But the care it offers that's inseparable from the surveillance and the control it demands.
And how do you see that playing out today, like practically?
Well, that control mechanism is exactly why religious institutions globally are often the main engine behind efforts to restrict human rights, whether that's about access to reproductive health care or challenging SOGI rights.
Right. Just quickly for listeners, SOGI is sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression rights, basically LGBTQ plus rights.
By institutions that wield precisely that pastoral power. And then there's the final piece. When that sacred claim, that non-negotiable truth, meets political power, you get religious nationalism. And that leads to these really intractable conflicts because your political opponents aren't just rivals anymore. They're framed as like theological enemies. Democratic compromise becomes almost impossible.
Okay. Let's clash on that duality of cohesion then, because you're focusing entirely on the negative side of that bonding. But look, high trust communities, especially ones that demand sacrifice, they're vital. They're vital for social resilience, for tackling problems that secular society really struggles with.
Like what specifically? What problem does it solve uniquely?
The free rider problem. The basic human temptation to get the benefits of the group without putting in the work. How do you get lots of people to genuinely sacrifice time, money, difficult behaviors for the collective good? Religion has this amazing mechanism, costly signaling.
Yeah, the Sosi study on the kibbutzim comes to mind.
Exactly. Richard Sosi's classic work. He showed those religious kibbutzim in Israel, the ones demanding really visible, time-consuming rituals and sacrifices like strict kosher rules or hours of communal work. They were way more cooperative, more internally stable than the secular ones nearby, which maybe just ask for a small fee. This isn't just about saying you're committed, it's about proving it through costly actions that filter out people who aren't serious. Secular groups, honestly, they find it incredibly hard to replicate that level of high trust, high sacrifice environment. That is a real, measurable net asset.
That is a compelling point, and I do appreciate the focus on the commitment mechanism. But haven't you just described the problem again? The costly signal proves commitment to the in-group, sure, but it simultaneously draws that sacred boundary that shuts others out. The mechanism itself defines who's in and who's out. The asset, the strong bond, and the liability, the exclusion, they're like two sides of the same coin. The boundary creates the trust, but the boundary also divides the wider society.
So you're saying the very thing that can save a community by fostering cooperation is also guaranteed to divide it from others?
Structurally, yeah, I think so. And we see that boundary weaponized all over the world, especially when religious identity lines up with inequality or political fights. Think about sectarian conflicts, right? Like the Sunni-Shia divide started theologically, but now it fuels wars and discrimination. Or look at how ethnic religious nationalism is used politically in places like Myanmar against the Rohingya or in India. The very design creates these deep, sometimes incredibly violent fault lines in pluralistic societies. And those costs, I argue, often completely swamp the local benefit of running a soup kitchen.
Okay, I'm still not quite convinced by that framing, because it feels like you're ignoring religion's really powerful prophetic function. You're painting it only as a tool of the status quo or this exclusive club, but that overlooks its history as a crucial moral check on power. When that moral authority is kept separate from state power, religion often becomes the main voice speaking out against oppression.
Okay, I acknowledge it has been a vehicle for liberation sometimes, sure.
It absolutely has. Look at liberation theology in Latin America, challenging brutal dictatorships by reading the Bible through the eyes of the poor, or the incredible organizational muscle of the Black church during the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. It provided the moral framework, the meeting places, the sheer organizational backbone against state-sponsored racism and violence. In those key moments, religion wasn't just about control. It was the engine of freedom. It was that vital source of moral authority when secular politics had completely failed.
That's fair and a necessary point. But doesn't it just reinforce my point about the structural duality? For every, prophetic voice like Desmond Tutu challenging apartheid using that charismatic authority, you had a massive established institution, the Dutch Reformed Church, providing explicit theological justification for apartheid, calling it God's ordained social order. The exact same sacred language that can be used to liberate the oppressed is simultaneously used globally to restrict the rights of others. Look at the global campaigns today against reproductive freedom or SOGI rights. The institutions pushing those claim they're offering care, moral guidance, that's the service model you like. But at the same time, they demand conformity and punishment for those who don't fit the mold. That's the policing model.
Okay.
The Foucauldian point stands. The social service bit, caring for the wounded, and the norm policing bit, policing the deviant, are two faces of the exact same pastoral power. Once you accept the care, you implicitly accept the authority that defines what's deviant or sinful. And today, that power is overwhelmingly used to reinforce traditional hierarchies, especially around gender and sexuality.
That sounds like a variable, doesn't it? Down to human interpretation, institutional choices, not necessarily a fatal flaw in the technology itself. Surely we can govern this power. Which brings us to the key question, right? How do we manage this cultural nuclear energy in a modern, diverse state? The net result isn't inherent to religion itself. It depends on the institutional design. We should be looking at models specifically designed to harness the good bits while neutralizing the political danger.
Okay, I think I know where you're going. Habermas? Post-secular society?
Exactly. Jürgen Habermas offers a potential path. He suggests that in a properly functioning modern state, religious citizens should bring their moral insights into the public square. But, and this is crucial, they have to follow a critical role. The translation proviso.
Can you just quickly unpack what that means, practically?
Sure. The translation proviso is basically a secularizing filter. It requires religious citizens to translate their theological arguments into universally accessible public reason. So instead of saying, the Bible says X, you have to translate that moral impulse into secular terms everyone can debate, like, this policy upholds human dignity, or this promotes ecological sustainability. The idea is we can extract the surplus value, the moral language, the commitment, while filtering out the non-negotiable dogma. That way, you get a net positive contribution to democratic debate.
I'm sorry, I just don't buy that the translation proviso actually works in practice. It's asking religious groups to basically give up their superpower, their claim to ultimate, sacred, non-negotiable truth. If a religious leader actually does follow the proviso perfectly, they kind of lose their distinct moral authority, don't they? They just become another NGO arguing about utility. But if they don't follow it, which, let's be honest, is mostly what happens, then they undermine the whole basis of democratic deliberation, which needs compromise.
But why do you think they consistently fail to adhere? Is it impossible?
Because compromise, when your position is seen as divinely mandated, often feels like betrayal. The evidence seems pretty overwhelming that when sacredness gets fused with political identity, especially in religious nationalism, compromise just gets rejected outright. You can't bargain away God's will at the political negotiating table. And this leads directly to systemic discrimination, repression. We see it playing out in major countries across the globe. Voting rights being restricted, attacks on academic freedom, all sorts of things, often justified explicitly by divine law. The overall cost of that political rigidity, which seems structurally linked to that high commitment you value, I think it far outweighs the social good of running a few charities. You can't really govern sacred claims once they enter politics. You can only try to minimize their fusion with state power.
Okay, look, I absolutely admit the duality. And the risks you've outlined are serious, especially that failure to compromise when identity and the sacred get tangled up in politics. But I still think the core argument holds. Religion is a unique generator of social trust, of that high commitment community, and yeah, that existential ballast that secular institutions and, frankly, modern alternatives just seem unable to replicate. They might help individuals find meaning, but they fail completely on that Durkheimian task, building large-scale, collective social solidarity. So the solution isn't getting rid of it, which is impossible anyway, but designing smart institutions. That means strict pluralism, clear separation of church and state, trying to manage the risk while maximizing the unique social surplus it offers, especially in places where the state itself is weak.
And I guess my position remains that the very things that make religion so effective, those strong boundaries, the high demands, the defining of a sacred us versus a profane them, are precisely what make it potentially toxic, polarizing, and even repressive in a diverse, pluralistic world. The risk of, fission, of conflict, control, systemic rights abuses, it just seems too high, too common, globally, and too structurally intertwined with the benefits to confidently call it a net positive in our current age. We just have to acknowledge that this particular social technology is inherently volatile and maybe often unstable in a modern, diverse context.
Yeah, it's definitely complicated. It's clearly not a simple yes or no. It really seems to depend entirely on context, on governance, on which aspect you prioritize. We're kind of left with that paradox, aren't we? We seem to need its energy for building vital human communities, but we're rightly fearful of its destructive power when that energy escapes democratic control.
Indeed, well put. Wrapping up today's RJ debate, hope you got some new insights. See you soon. Keep curious.